and welcome to Represent the Podcast, the show where I, Caiti Beth McKinney, sit down with composers from historically marginalized and underrepresented backgrounds and discuss their works for the horn. Hope you enjoy, and thanks for tuning in. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Represent the Podcast, the show where we're going to talk about works for horn by historically underrepresented and marginalized composers. So today I have with me Michelle Stebleton, who is the professor of horn at Florida State University. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about her pieces. We're going to go over how she writes for horn, why she writes for horn, which might be a little obvious, but we'll see. Michelle, thank you for being here. I'm so excited to have you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I am honored.
So how did you start in music and composing? And those are probably two very different questions.
Well, yeah, starting in music was, I was born into music. My mother is a professional musician, a pianist. And so, yeah, I've been playing horn for longer than I should have for how well I play. I've been playing horn for a lot of years. But in terms of the composition, I'm only just now beginning to identify as a composer. It's a very new thing in my life to be doing at this level. I took one composition class at the University of Michigan, and I started that class with William Bolcom and finished with Leslie Bassett. So pretty good teachers, although I admit it was only one class and I've never had formal lessons. I operate on more of an instinct and having paid attention to how music is crafted. I would never put myself on the same level as experienced and trained composers, though. So maybe in another 50 pieces, but it's a brand new journey.
I kind of love that. I mean, that's the world we're living in is where we're just kind of faking it until we make it, really. So, I didn't consider myself a professional horn player, but then I said, oh wait, I'm making my money off of playing horn, so I guess that's what I do. And so it's very funny how those little things kind of snowball until we're like, oh yeah, that is a label I can apply to myself, which is pretty great. This might be a silly question, but what drew you to compose for the horn specifically?
Well, in your intro, I play horn. Yeah, that was sort of a no-brainer. I have not, I have composed a few pieces for other instruments as well, but nothing that either was complete or that I liked. Kind of focusing on horn.
Yeah, great. And what gave you that first moment where you're like, I kind of want to write something down? Like, did you have a melody in your head that was spinning around, or?
The first time that I was outside of class, outside of having it be an assignment, the first time that I really was motivated to write something down was I had a student when I was teaching in Midland, Texas, and I believe he was an eighth grader, and we were trying to find a piece for him for solo and ensemble, and he was kind of annoying me. I don't like that. No, I don't like that. No, I don't like that. Because I played a few measures of this, that, and the other. And finally I said, well, what do you want? And he said, well, I want something that's familiar. And I said, well, if it's familiar, it means you've played it. You need to play something new. Well, no, not that kind of familiar, but just sort of familiar. And I kind of lost my, I kind of lost myself a little, and I got snide, which maybe he didn't recognize as snide. I don't know. And I said, well, what do you want? Variations on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? And I picked up my horn and I started just messing around with Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And his eyes lit up and he said, yeah, I want to play that piece. What's that piece called? And so I went home and wrote it. And I wrote a variation on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star that was a grade 4. And I put in the things that he wasn't practicing well or that he was struggling with in his etudes. And then I asked him what one element did he want to have in the piece, and he said double tonguing. So of course it was a theme of variations, and the last variation, dun 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 dun. So I was able to put in the double tonguing for him, and he was completely jazzed and played it for solo and ensemble. So that was when I started. That was 32 years ago, and then I tried writing a few things along the way. I wouldn't say to great success. And then I started getting inspired, yeah, just a few years ago, figuring out at this point in my journey that unaccompanied horn literature is my genre. That's what I love. That's what I've loved doing and performing. And that's really where I wanted to be writing. So the first piece that I had published, Haya Habana, was inspired from my trip to Cuba, and combine that with I needed to be practicing low register and multiphonic. So I basically wrote it as an etude for myself. And then the second piece, Luna Boliviana, was it was inspired by my missing my friend in Bolivia. And during the pandemic, the lockdown portion of the pandemic, I think we still have a pandemic, but when I was teaching online all day long, one of my Zoom backgrounds was the Valley of the Moon in Bolivia. And it feels sort of desolate and lonely. And and that of course matched this image of how many people were handling the pandemic. And so I started just kind of improvising on the horn. And then admittedly, I did do some research on Bolivian music to finish the piece because the first half was improvised from my heart from that experience. And then I did a little bit of study on their music to craft the rest of the piece. But that was how that piece came about.
That's such a beautiful inspiration. I think that's so important to have that little germ of an idea that leads into something musical. And that's where I've tried composing myself and have horribly, horribly failed. And I always get stuck on the idea. And I'm like, oh, maybe I should try something else. And so here I am podcasting.
Which is
But
fantastic. Somebody needs to do it. So
I guess that's fair. And I love the idea of challenging yourself, really taking that on with your piece and being like, okay, this is what I need to work on. Because, let's be honest, we all need to work on our low registers. We all need to work on multiphonics. Those are some of the hardest things to do on our instrument, I think. And to make them sound, beautiful, I think is even more challenging. So when you are writing for horn, what are some difficulties that you bump into?
well, as I said, I haven't written that many pieces so far, but if
Hmm.
I'm writing an etude for myself, I have a tendency to make it way too hard for anybody to actually want to play. Um,
I think you said in one of your emails that you think Kaya Habana is unplayable, right?
it is, it's unplayable. I mean, I can play it with poorly tuned multiphonics because I'm not great at multiphonics. So for me, it's playable, but if you don't mind the intonation, but for the general person, it's not really playable. The Luna Boliviana, a little part of it was meant to be kind of a high horn etude, and
Mhm.
and I feel like high is my strength. So yeah, I can play it sort of. My student played it at the International Horn Conference beautifully. Yeah, it is playable, but it's difficult. So
Mhm.
finding the correct difficulty level for the intended audience when my ideas go, I because I do get ideas and they start running in my head and they go far beyond who my intended audience is because now I'm thinking about my intended audience. With the
Right.
next piece, the piece I'm writing now, I've set parameters on myself as to I want my intended audience to be somebody who wants to play something sort of a little more active than the Kroll Adagio and maybe a little more technically difficult, but not as difficult as Espana, for example. So it needs to be sort of in between that. And that means I don't want to go above a high B. I don't want to
Mhm.
have a zillion lip trills. I don't want to have a random pedal E that pops out at the end of 4.5 minutes. I mean, not that I don't love that piece. It's that's one of the pieces that got me places.
Mhm.
I love Espana and I love the Kroll. I think it's a beautiful, profound work. But
Mhm.
we need something in between. And
Yes. Kind of a
now
stepping
I'm
stone to learn that style.
yeah. So now I'm writing
Right.
for an intended audience or an intended performer, and I need to keep the parameters within that. And
Would you
you
say
know,
your intended performer is a college student? That would be like learning how to do unaccompanied horn, or
yeah. So maybe a sophomore performance major, somebody
oh,
taking
wonderful.
unaccompanied work to a competition. I just
Hmm.
judged the International Horn Competition of America, and we heard the same three pieces over and over, even though there were 7 or 8 on the list. That we
Hmm.
chose from. Now, I don't know if the people who didn't make the second round had chosen different pieces, but we need another piece to fill that role of something
Hmm.
that's both lyrical and technical, like an exam piece would be, both lyrical and technical, a little high, a little low, a little hand stopped, and, you know, one or two advanced techniques, but nothing crazy and nothing so sedate that it doesn't perk their interest, whether it's the performer
Right.
or the audience.
Yeah, that sounds like that's a very fine line. And especially with unaccompanied pieces, I think that can very easily go into sounding like an etude and sounding, we lose the audience sometimes. I've performed the Persichetti several times now, and it's always funny to me when my non-musician family come, the members who don't do this for a living, and they come and they hear that piece and they go, okay, that was a little weird, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. They're not used to listening to this kind of music.
I think that one's very difficult to sell because it's
Hmm.
hard to latch on to a story. You know, the Kroll, I think you can sell it without a story, but if you give the audience a few sentences about what it's about, you can play
Hmm.
it for literally anyone and they will love the piece. And España, of course, tells a story and it's all, kitsch Spanish music. So that's fun and entertaining and familiar. And
Hmm.
the Berga Hornlock tells a story of vistas and you can really hear the sounds of Scandinavia and
Oh, yeah, that's beautiful.
visual of Scandinavia. Yeah, so I think the Persichetti is one of the more difficult ones to
Hmm.
sell as a performer. Um,
I've performed it once in my undergraduate career and then once again years later, and I found that when I spoke to my audience, for me it's about, I hear outer space. That may be completely my own brain, but I'm just hearing the planets zooming around. Go figure. But yeah, I found that speaking to the audience about it definitely engaged them a lot more. Is that something you teach your students at FSU, is how to speak to the audience in a recital setting or anything like that?
we talk about doing that. Wouldn't say that most of my students choose to. I struggle getting them to go beyond their name and what piece they're going to play. I'm
Hmm.
starting now to put it in the syllabus as a mandatory requirement. It's starting with my graduate students that
Hmm.
they have a requirement that they must give oral program notes, and
Oh, that's wonderful.
they love it. The grad students think that it is a great way to connect with the audience. I think the younger students are just fearful of it.
Hmm. I would have been petrified in my undergrad to speak to my audience, but as I've gone through way too many degrees, I definitely have learned that that's so important. If you don't have a rapport with the audience, it's a mediocre performance, even if you play wonderfully. It's so. I think that's wonderful that you're working with students on that. That's so important. I wish I did that more when I was that age. It would have come easier later. um,
You didn't ask about this, but
oh no,
I think
please.
that a great performance can sell mediocre music, and a poor performance can unsell really great music. So,
Hmm.
as much as a composer might write the most profound music in the world or the most fun music in the world, if it's not performed well or with
Hmm.
a good intention, a musical intention, then it doesn't matter what the composer wrote. So composers rely 100% on performers. And maybe I say this because I've spent most of my life a performer, and I'm not saying performers are more important. We need to have notes to play, but the performers are integral to the composer having a successful piece.
I 100% agree. Completely agree. And that's a really profound thought. And I want this podcast to be for both performers and composers to listen to. So I think that's really good advice for both sides of it, especially with, maybe composers who are working with performers, working with them on the story of the piece so that when they go to perform it for the first time, they have a very clear image of the music of it. I think as horn players, since our instrument is so precarious at times, we get caught up in the notes and the technique, and I think we forget that it's about the music and it's about enjoying what we're playing, or hopefully enjoying what we're playing. So yes, I think that's really important. To circle back to how you compose, what is your composition process like? Do you start with a melody and expand from there? You said you did with the variations, but when you're doing more complex music like High Humana, where do you kind of start with that?
Yeah, I start with a melody, and it either is inspired by somebody else's music or like I said with the Luna Boliviana with a photo and a place and a feeling. I compose with the horn in my hands. I compose from behind the horn. So I start playing something and I might not hit record right away, but I will play and play and then go, ooh, I think I'm getting somewhere. And then I'll hit record on my phone so that I can document the 18th time that I've done something a little differently. And if I like that one, I like it on my phone and move on. And then I put pencil to paper. I'm a manuscript paper kind of girl.
I was going to ask. I love knowing that.
Yeah, and I don't even, uh, gosh, High Habana wasn't even really written on manuscript paper. It was written like scribbled on notebook paper for the most part, just like little lines that looked like little mountains, or the little wolf calls in the Miss Anne. Like
Oh yeah.
I would write a note or three note names and some squiggles that looked like that, and that was my manuscript. It was really embarrassing.
Do you
Yeah,
still have that manuscript?
probably somewhere.
Oh, you should hang on to that. That'll be fun someday
That'd be
somebody's gonna write their
someday.
paper. Right. You gotta put it in a museum someday.
So yeah, my current piece, I am putting it on manuscript paper. I start with the horn, and then once I get something I think I like, and I play it, a lot of times, a lot of different ways, and then put it down on paper. That's when I can start editing, and I know maybe even when I'm writing it down on paper, this transition doesn't work, but then at that point, seeing it, that visual connection is helpful for me. So it doesn't all have to be sort of a memorized, plucked out of my head kind of thing. And we are graphic notation readers after all. So yeah, I do that. And then so far I've paid other people to do the engraving in Finale because I admit I have very poor Finale skills. I mean, I can put something in Finale to a rudimentary level, but then I have to pay somebody to fix it.
Well, at a certain point, sometimes it's just easier to do someone like faster. They're gonna get it done faster than we. I also have terrible finale skills, so I'm set. You go do it. This is your skill set. Thank you. I appreciate you. So it's worth the time and the investment in it.
And I'm happy to support a student who needs the money.
Oh, that's a very good point too. And all these like very young undergraduate students are so much more tech savvy than I could ever hope to be. And so it's wonderful to just let them get into it and get going.
Yep.
That's so great. We love that. So now your piano parts, you said you've done a little bit of that since you did solo and ensemble. I'm assuming that was with piano as well, right? How do you find composing for piano?
Well, I think the problem is that I wrote a piano part that I could play. And
Mm.
I had 5 years of piano lessons from age 5 to 10. So clearly, those piano parts, the piano part in the Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, um, could have been played by a 10-year-old. And I think that I could conceive of something more advanced than that, but if I have somebody who is interested and willing to do that, I would rather enter into a collaboration and stick to the horn side of things and let someone else deal with the pianistic side of things. I don't know. I might at some point consider doing something more complex with piano on my
Mhm.
own, and I may consider taking lessons and learning to play better because of composition. But that's all in the future for the moment.
Well, there's something kind of nice about bringing in somebody who has the piano chops because then it becomes collaborative. Composing can get a little lonely if you're just by yourself, tinkering around with things. So getting someone else's ear on something is kind of nice, and it may inspire you to different melodic, movements or things like that. So I
Right.
think
Or
that's
new harmonies. Yeah.
or new harmonies exactly. I always am surprised by the things that my friends come up with when I'm listening to what they're improvising on the piano and my ear doesn't follow them. It's so much fun to hear everyone else's minds at work. So this is kind of a broad question, but how would you characterize your compositional language? I know it's a weird esoteric question.
Okay, so I haven't written enough music yet to say that I have a compositional language, but if I had to characterize, I would say that it's hornistic. It is
Oh.
idiomatic for the instrument, and it might be really hard, but it's still idiomatic. So, for instance, in
Mhm.
Haya Hibana, there's a lick that I don't have my horn sitting in front of me, but it goes and those are all placed on overtones. So throw down your B flat side open, and you have the first couple licks, and then it's E flat horn, F horn, and so it's idiomatic. It may be
Right.
difficult, but it's idiomatic. So I do understand how the horn works and what will and will not work on the horn. So
And there's definitely music you can play sometimes where you can tell the composer did not have an understanding of how the horn works.
yeah,
That does exist in the world.
I saw an orchestral part recently, and I don't want to go too more specific than that.
Sure.
There was a high D just plucked out of the thin air.
Oh, goodness.
Okay, in theory that's possible, but you're not going to get a lot of
Hmm.
performances with that. And possible doesn't make it probable, likely, or having willing participants.
Right. And then there's moments of peril in extremely well-known pieces that we know. I just played the Beethoven Emperor Concerto a little while ago, and I think we all know that high B flat piano entrance in the principal horn, and it's a peril. It may or may not happen that day. It coming in so softly on that high pitch without anything going wrong is always a question mark. So
Yeah, we don't
yeah,
need
it's
any more of
absolutely.
that in our literature. We need
No, there's so much of it.
accessible. Yeah.
Completely agree. So I know that you, like you said, you are, new to the composition game in terms of really considering yourself that. So you probably haven't worked a lot with commissioners or anything like that, but have you yourself commissioned pieces?
Yeah, I have not yet worked with commissioners.
Hmm.
But yes, I've commissioned, I don't know, more than 2 dozen works,
Oh,
either
that's incredible.
for unaccompanied horn, horn and piano, or two horns and piano,
Hmm.
Bontrager. I've been involved with the commissioning of a lot of music. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Can you speak on that and talk about that process?
Sure. So, yeah, so the process, well, you have to ask somebody. So
Right.
ideally, you pick somebody and at a time that they're able to say yes, that you give them enough time and it's not, hey, could you write this by next week? Um, and then if it's somebody it makes it a lot easier. If it's someone who knows your playing and your integrity, that's helpful. You can cold call people as well.
Hmm.
That has worked. I've been surprised by some composers who've said yes, and but most of the composers I've commissioned from were people that I knew,
Hmm.
and so that was helpful. Yeah, you ask them how much they're going to charge, and you have to find the funding to do it. We do have the
Hmm.
Mayor Ramon Commissioning Assistance Fund through the International Horn Society, and that's very helpful.
Oh.
It's helped with a lot of my commissions and the ones that Lisa and I have done. Maybe it might have been in her name, but it would be on
Mhm.
behalf of our group.
And Lisa is your duo partner,
Oh,
right?
Lisa Bontrager.
Yes.
Yes, we have a horn duo
Yes.
called Mirror Image, and
Right. I believe I've
so
heard your recording of the Oasin. I've played
yes.
that one on repeat a couple times actually.
Yes. Yeah, that was a commissioned work.
Oh,
I
that's
I knew
commissioned.
Eric because he had been a regular guest at FSU, and so
Hmm.
I asked him. I said, I'm asking for the sun and the moon, but is there any way that you could write a piece for two horns and piano? And he said, yes, I can
Hmm.
do it, and like dashed it off, and there we have Gold Coast Harmony.
And that's someone who knows how to write for horn. You can hear that in everything he writes. He's spent some time with some horn players, which is really great.
Yeah, yeah, he's a wonderful man. His sonata is a little bit difficult, and there is actually a story behind that, but it's not mine to tell. So,
Fair enough.
maybe a different. Actually, the way that I got started in commissioning music, I was pretty young. It was right out of the gate when I came to Florida State University. I started my job here at age 24, and I knew nothing, and I wasn't established in the profession, and so the first time that I wanted to perform at an international horn conference, I asked the host, and the host said, well, the only place that I can find for you is on the new music concert, because back then they had a separate concert just for the weird new music, and everything else was,
Right.
Ducat Villanelle and Glier and all that. And so I was relegated to this new music concert. And so I thought, well, let's see, new music. I had just met Paul Basler and like, hey, Paul, could you write me something for this? Unaccompanied, because I was told there wouldn't be a pianist available. So there was my first commission or commissioned piece that I commissioned. And
Mhm.
and then the next year, I'd love to play on this conference. Well, the only place I can put you is the new music program. So, hey, Paul, could you write me another piece? And so that's kind of how I got started. And then I did branch out and commission from other people. But that was also what taught me that I loved unaccompanied music. I
Mhm.
was forced into and new music. I was forced into doing it and then discovered myself along the way. I had only played one unaccompanied piece before that, and that was España on my senior recital. But
Mhm.
other than that, I'd never played any unaccompanied music. I hadn't played a lot of modern music. I think it depends on what you call modern. I had
Mhm.
20th century music. I had played in the the Contemporary Directions Ensemble at the University of Michigan. So I played a lot of really new music, but not horn centered new music.
So what is it about unaccompanied music that you love?
I love that you have to create the entire experience for the audience, and there's no one else to help you. It all relies directly on you, and so there's more responsibility that you have to bring to the phrasing, and then I think it depends on the composer. With a lot of pieces, there's a little more leeway if you're by yourself as far as how you address some of that musicality. I'm somebody known for taking liberties, and so that fits me very well. Now there are pieces out there that you wouldn't take liberties. The composer writes exactly every single note, every single rest, every single accent and staccato. But a lot of composers, I think they write something and hope that the performer will just be a good musician and sell it in a positive musical way. So that's what I love.
Oh, that's fabulous. I think that's great too. And I kind of fell into playing unaccompanied music the same way. And for me, the Persichetti was the first one, but the second one I found, and it was actually a student who had won the IHS composition contest, I believe, with this piece, Alexis Carrier, The Final Battle Cry, if you know that one.
Yes.
Yep, that piece for me just sealed the deal. I was like, this is what I wanted. This is so much fun. So it's finding those moments in the silences, I think, that is really magical.
Well, and that's a big thing when you are performing unaccompanied music is you have to allow for those silences. And my
Mhm.
first performance was with España, and I remember having to write into my music 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds to sit and count. And of course, I probably went 1001, 1002, 1004. I'm sure that 4 seconds was probably only two. And I would do that.
Right.
Say it was great, but the silences weren't long enough. It's like, oh, but I wrote in to count them and I know I counted them, but I'm sure I counted them too fast. And so that's, yeah, you're right that the music has to breathe and you have to find how to live in the silences as well.
And then the hardest thing about that is time moves differently on stage. I think it pulls and stretches and rushes when we think it's not, and it's definitely very different. So when you are going to commission a piece, do you have an idea for a subject in mind, or do you just find somebody you like and say, "Hey, I want this," or how does that kind of work?
I've done both.
Mhm.
So sometimes just I would love a piece for unaccompanied horn, maybe that parameter, or I commissioned the Paul Basler cantos for the Southeast Horn Workshop student competition. And so I did put some parameters on it that this was going to be for students. And Lisa and I, with our Safari album, we commissioned works with the theme Safari, and we let the composer take it wherever they wanted. So we have animal safaris of different kinds. We have a safari of existentialism. We have different types of safaris on that album. So that was really fun to see if we gave them such a broad theme, what they would do with it. And I like giving a composer enough leeway that they can be themselves and do something that they want to create. But I think it is also helpful to put parameters on something if you need it to be playable by a certain group of people or to fit the theme of a program. I think it's fair to put some parameters on.
And that kind of leads me to I guess my next set of advice questions for young performers who'd like to commission a piece. As someone who's been on both sides of it, how would you? Let's say you've never commissioned a piece before. You're somebody who's in their undergraduate degree or something like that, and you want to commission a piece, and the composer sends something back to you, and you don't love it. Has that ever? I want to ask you, for specifics or anything, but has that ever happened to you? If you want to help guide the process, is there any advice for that?
It has happened to me. Um, it's a tough spot to be in. I'm not sure that I always handled it as well as I should have. Um, in a few cases, uh, there was willingness to perform and record the work, and it was the record engineer who said, the record producer said, "Nope, this isn't going on the album."
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so that's happened, unfortunately. Again,
Hmm.
I was probably not woman enough to be gracious about it in the way that it was handled, and I do regret that. Yeah, if you can have a relationship with a composer and work with that person, that is really helpful. Some composers I think are very willing, and others are not so much. It depends on the person. I remember I was well, FSU was part of a consortia commission for the Sea Dreams by David Mazzlanka for two horns and wind band, and we got the first copy. There were 10 schools involved in this commission. We got the first copy of the horn part, and within an hour, 9 people had emailed David and said, "This spot is unplayable." It was
Oh, wow.
a that went on for days.
Oh, so like he does in his woodwind quintets.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was impossible, and I was the only person who didn't email him. And again, maybe I should have said something. Although there were 9 other people who had already contributed that to the conversation, I looked at it and said, "Oh, that's unplayable. I'll have to take a breath in the middle." And that was actually how he solved the problem. He said, "Oh, well, you can just take a breath here." And he didn't rewrite the B that took forever. Nobody said it's unplayable because we don't want to sustain a high B for that long. They said it's
Mhm.
unplayable because we can't sustain it for that long without breathing. So he added a breath. He didn't take away the high B. I think better communication, maybe the 10 of us could have gotten together and said, what do we want to tell him about this? Do we just
Mhm.
want to say add a breath, or do we want to recommend, can the note not be this long? Maybe after
Right.
the breath to take it down an octave for the rest of the note. Like we could have maybe approached it in a different way. Instead, we
Mhm.
all had to play a really, really, really long high B with a breath in it. And now it's out there, so anybody else playing
Mhm.
keys has to do the same thing. So
Right. And it is a beautiful piece.
it is a beautiful piece. It's
Mhm.
also really facey.
Right. That's a good word, facey. I haven't heard that one, but I really like that a lot. I'm gonna steal that.
As I've gotten older, I think now I'm much more interested in having those kinds of communications. I
Mhm.
did tell a composer no once when he asked me if I could play 3 notes at a time. And I said, "Well, I can play one and sing one, and if you write the correct notes, I can get resultant overtones if I can sing them in tune.
Right.
But you have to find something that works in the range of the horn and my voice that I can, do those and get them in tune." And he said, "No, no, no. I mean, play 2 notes and sing one." And he wanted me to split my aperture and get the octave, when you double buzz
Oh,
and you get the octave,
yeah.
and then sing. And I said, "No."
That's a technique that would work beautifully for the cello, but for the horn, maybe not so much. Yeah.
I just didn't want to explore that, and I just held a flat no. And
Yeah,
and
fair
yeah,
enough.
he was very disappointed, and I felt badly that he was disappointed, but that was just beyond my interest of technique.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah. So we're gonna switch gears kind of entirely and move into the music industry section, if that's all right. I'd love to know if you feel like you've had any challenges in your career, any obstacles you butted up against. I know you started being a professor at a young age. I imagine that was probably a little intimidating.
That was very intimidating. Yeah, extremely intimidating. The relaxation long tones that I sort of became famous for about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, those were born because I had developed so much anxiety in playing from starting the job so early. And I was also on a 1 year position and had to re audition for the job. So I felt that
Mm,
first year as if every concert were my audition. And I developed an anxiety issue. And so the relaxation long tones were that was my response. How do I develop a way of playing without all of this anxiety? So I've been championing relaxed playing ever since then. That would have been 1991 or 1992, maybe, a long time ago. So yeah, I've had a lot of challenges, and the challenges change as you go through the different stages of your career, and especially in a career where you have so many different elements. It's not that you go to work and you do one thing and you do one thing all the time. You do so many different things. So I can say that I personally was the biggest challenge to my own career. I didn't know enough when I began, and I didn't know enough to find a mentor. And back then, they didn't assign people mentors. Now, I think most programs give you a mentor when you start, but I didn't know enough to even ask for one. I had some personal challenges along the way. There were some times that I didn't push myself hard enough when I should have. And now I'm getting older. I'm facing, just the physical challenges of getting older, my reluctance to jump into social media. I have so far chosen not to very much. Um, and that's, yeah, I'm getting in my own way. Or maybe mentally, just, like with this anxiety that had developed. So many of my challenges have been myself getting in my own way. But I can say learning to be a better teacher has been a lifelong challenge. And I'm not done yet. There are days that I don't live up to being the teacher that I want to be, but I keep trying. And learning how to play the horn better it's always been an issue. And Mr. Stout, if you're listening, um, I should have let you change my embouchure. You were
Oh, is that not the most frustrating thing when you look back at your old teachers and I'm like, I'm so sorry, you were right the whole time. I
Yes.
can look at every single one of my former teachers and say that to their faces.
Yes, my embouchure has been the bane of my existence my entire career. Um, yeah. So and then I mean, there have been other challenges too. I mean, lots and lots, and some of them just because I was young and stupid. Some of them because maybe I chose not to work hard enough, or I worked in the wrong way,
Mm,
or didn't understand. Um, I didn't understand the social construct of my job. Uh, there have been some hardships along the way, just yes, because I was a woman. I will flat out say that. But a lot of the problems didn't have as much to do with my being a woman as my getting in my own way or being an idiot.
That's there's something about that. I have found I've had a similar experience, and I have really tried to channel that into my teaching so that I can look at my students and hopefully they'll listen. I mean, sometimes people have to learn for themselves, which is the mistake that I made over and over. But I can say, hey, I did this exact same thing and butted my head against this wall as many times as you're doing. It's much easier if you walk around the wall, and that's I think the painful beauty of learning how to do these things all on your own is that you can then pass them to the next generation and wince when they make the same mistakes, but cheer when they don't. And then you mentioned being a woman and the hardships that come with that, and that's one of the next questions I wanted to talk about is do you feel like you've experienced any obstacles based on gender identity growing up, playing horn?
Yes, yes. And now in my
Mhm.
hometown, I did not experience that at all. It was an incredibly supportive environment. The head of our music program was a man, but a very enlightened, wonderful human being. And my first horn teacher was a woman, and so I didn't see any gender bias growing up.
Mhm.
We didn't really have other very many races in our town, so I didn't see any racial bias, but we also didn't have a lot of diversity in just tiny little town. 98% Caucasian Republican. I didn't really see that, but then once I left, I I did it. Yes, so yes, I have. I can say that being a woman has not always helped my career. So this is where I get into the dilemma of, as an older woman now, I feel like I should be letting girls know where we were at and where we're at now and how far we've come. And I have a lot of stories. I also have a philosophy though, that if the people who wronged me have changed the way that they do business or changed their belief system, it's not my place to out them. At this point,
Okay.
I embrace their changes and I celebrate the wins. And
Mhm.
it's not my place to tell those stories because it would now harm the men who have learned and become gracious and open-minded. And so I don't really want to get it too involved in that. But yes, there I have a lot of stories. Um, most women of my generation have felt bias at every turn, and I am very
Mhm.
thankful for the women who came before me and really paved the way, because every generation it's easier.
Right. It definitely you when you hear the stories of people who were active in the 30s, 40s, 50s, when you read about Helen Kotos, and then when you read in the 60s and 70s and all these different generations that came about, you can definitely see the progress we're going through. Obviously, we probably both can agree that there's always more that can be improved upon. Um,
100%.
So do you have any advice for, young women horn players, or anybody who's coming up against that marginalized, barrier in this day and age?
Well, I think that to some extent, and this is very I'm broadly stereotyping. There are
Hmm.
two kinds of women: the women who are out there loud and proud, shouting at the world that we need to change things, and we need those people. And then there are the
Hmm.
women who just keep their head down and do their work and hope that they at some point get what they deserve in terms of recognition. And yes, maybe they have to do their job better than the people around them. And I've always been that type of person. I didn't have the constitution to poke my head up and scream lawsuit or share those stories with the world. I've just always tried to keep my head down, do my job, and hope at some point that my doing my job helps to elicit change. That the change comes from my everyday actions of inviting men into the conversation instead of yelling at them that they need to just change.
Sure.
There's room for both in the world. I have a great amount of respect for the women who have taken their employers to court and who
Hmm.
shared their really ugly stories with the world. And I know a lot of those women have been persecuted for it. And so
Hmm.
I value and appreciate what they were able to do that I didn't feel comfortable doing. But
Hmm.
there's also merit, I think, in doing your job well and one person at a time, inviting them to see that you're not the enemy and that you, yes, indeed, can do the job.
Hmm. It's kind of a
So,
two-pronged attack. Yeah.
two-pronged attack. And I think that you
Hmm.
need to decide to some extent. I mean, there's obviously room in the middle, but for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, or the same for every inaction. So as you go through your life, you have to decide, is this the battle that I want to fight? What are the consequences of fighting that battle? And will I win the war over this battle? Or if I can't live with those consequences, maybe this isn't the right battle. Maybe there's a different way. Like you were saying about hitting your head against a wall when you're struggling with, like a horn technique or something.
Hmm.
Find a way to go around the wall. And it's kind of that way. You have to decide, do you want to hit your head against the wall until you break it? But the result of that is that you now have a broken, bleeding head and can
Right.
no longer function. Or do you find a way around the wall, and it might take longer and it might
Hmm.
be much of a quieter trip? Which one is more effective? I think there's room in the world for both. But each woman has to decide for herself, how far do I want to go with this particular torch? Is it worth getting fired over? If it's not worth getting fired over, then maybe that's not the right battle. The different way to win that battle. So,
Right. And I imagine that can be frustrating advice to some people who want the change now, who want it fixed now. And it's really hard, especially as you get older and you have the bills, that come in, and you say, okay, I can't afford to be unemployed, and that's a tricky line to walk
it
for
is.
sure.
I think
Um,
it's an easier line when you're young and have no responsibilities. And
right.
it's an easier line when you're retired and have no responsibilities,
Hmm.
on either end of it. But when you're in the middle of it, yeah, it's a very difficult decision. And each person has to
Hmm.
figure out for him or herself, whether it's being a woman or any other marginalized, part of society. There are people out there doing the hard work of the fight. And I embrace and truly appreciate those people. I just could never have been one of them. I wouldn't
Right.
still have my job. My not having my job in music and being a flight attendant wouldn't wouldn't have helped this profession any. By keeping my
Hmm.
head down and continuing to do my job hopefully well, maybe I've affected change just in being here, in being the first female
Hmm.
brass teacher at FSU. Stuck it out, and I'm still here after all of these years. I'm still employed and can be an example and bring in um, women or underrepresented people into the program and
Right.
educate them. And so maybe I'm doing as much good the way that maybe I'm rationalizing, I don't know, but I feel like there's room for both. Everybody can't get fired over their jobs because then there would be no jobs with women in them.
Right. And I imagine in the 90s when you were hired on, you probably could count the number of women horn professors on one hand, let alone women brass professors. So, yeah, getting that first step in the door was huge. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like and about getting that job? Because I know that's not quite what this podcast is about, but and you don't have to talk about this for too long if you don't want to, but I'm curious about how that went.
No, it's actually it's a story about networking and doing what you do to the best of your abilities, and a lot of luck. I believe that luck
Hmm.
is preparation meeting opportunity. So but I had luck. I had just done the American Horn Competition. Now it's the International Horn Competition in America. But I had won the university division and tied for second in the natural horn division, and there were photos in a spread in the horn call. So this is the background information. So our trumpet professor here asked another trumpet player that he knew in town who was married to one of our vocal faculty. Do you know of anybody we should be inviting to apply for this position? We're opening it up as either associate or assistant. Just kind of hedging our bets and not knowing what we're going to get. And he said, "Oh, well, there's this girl from my wife's hometown," because the vocal faculty was from my hometown and grew up a mile from me, a couple of years older than I am. So every time that the two of them had come home to visit their family, they would listen to me play in a local contest or at the church or in a college recital. They always had a recital for the music majors over Christmas. So they had heard me play lots of times. And then that particular trumpet player happened to read the horn call. And he said, "Well, there's this girl from my wife's hometown, and she just won these competitions, and we know her. She'd be great." So they called me and invited me to apply. And I have to say that a horn player in my life at that time looked at me and said, "Oh, you're just the token female for the applicant pool."
Oh no.
And I, here I am thinking, "Oh, they invited me to apply. I have a chance at this." And yeah, I was told flat out, "You're the token female. They just need to
Whoa.
stack the applicant pool so that it looks like diversity." I mean, we didn't have the word diversity back then, really, but
Hmm.
and yeah, I was the token, and so I submitted my application, and 6 months went by, and I heard nothing except through the grapevine. I had heard that they had hired somebody, and apparently the grapevine was wrong. They had not hired somebody, so they tried to call me. So at that point, they said, "Well, who are we going to get? We'll make it a 1-year position." And the people who had recommended me in the first place, the woman who was on the music faculty, went supposedly. I just learned this story over Thanksgiving. She
No
went
kidding.
she went into the dean's office and said, "You need to hire Michelle. She's the right person."
Wow.
And so they went and pulled my stuff out of the no pile. And they said, "Well, anybody in the committee know any of her references?" They tried calling me, and my answering machine just kept leaving, just kept, it was the answering machine. I wasn't home. I lived in Texas.
Hmm.
And I wasn't home, and I wasn't picking up my messages because I didn't expect anybody to be calling me. It was in June, and I'd applied in January. So anyway, so Jim Croft, who was our director of bands, said, "Well, I know H. Bob Reynolds, who was the director of bands at Michigan, so I'll call him." And Bob said, "I don't know her phone number, but I know where she is right now," because his wife, and they weren't married yet, but his wife and I are really good friends. And I was visiting her. And at that moment, I was in Ann Arbor visiting Kristen. So he called to Kristen's apartment and said, "Kristen, tell Michelle to call Jim Croft." So I called, and they said, "We want you to come and audition. Can you come tomorrow?" And I was barely practicing. I was in playing prelude music for your brother's wedding shape. Um, could be better than it
Yeah.
than it was. It was middle movements of Mozart's shape. I wasn't in audition fighting shape, and but I had my horn with me at least. So I was in Michigan. My family's from Michigan, and my brother's in Pittsburgh. So his wedding was in Pittsburgh. So I was able to buy an entire week by saying, "I can't possibly come. It's my brother's wedding. I will fly home to
Ah.
Texas on such and such a day, and then I can fly out the next day. So that, well, I guess we'll have to wait a week if we, I guess we have to. And so that bought me an entire week to practice. And so at that
I
point,
love that.
my horn and I bonded, and I would only perform music on the, because there was a recital, there's a half recital on an audition, and I could only play music that was memorized because I didn't have any music with me except middle movements of Mozart. So
Oh.
luckily I'd done all these competitions. So I performed first movement of Mozart 2, the Franz Nocturne, and the Francese Divertimento, because those were the things that were memorized. There were two measures in
Mhm.
Francese that I couldn't remember while I was in Michigan and Pittsburgh. And when I got home, I could open up my music and remember the two measures. And I flew out here and I played and I got the job that day. But it was a 1 year and I had to
Mhm.
re-audition. So,
Right.
so then the next year I re-auditioned, and fortunately I was able to keep the job. I had a couple of other job auditions lined up and had to call and say I'm not.
Yeah, I'm taken now. Sorry. Yeah.
I'm taken. So yeah, that was how I came to be at FSU.
Did that feel a little vindicating getting to rub that in the face of the person who said, you don't have
Yes,
to answer that if you don't want to, but
yes.
okay, good. Little moment of triumph,
A
like take that.
resounding yes.
That's wonderful. We love those moments where we're like, yeah, no, I am here because I deserve to be here and not because I'm checking some box, you
Well,
know?
and the funny thing is, as of 1990, at least at FSU, being a female was no longer considered a minority. Even though we weren't equitable in the hiring, we were
Right.
no longer considered a minority. So I didn't actually tick a box.
So there you go. It was all just because you earned it in the very first place, and you could prove that.
There was a lot of luck and networking that I hadn't ever done intentionally, but
Hmm.
between the preparation of doing the competitions, playing in everything in my hometown where I just happened to be seen by the right people,
Hmm.
but like I said, luck is preparation meeting opportunity. And I'd done the preparation, and then the opportunity suddenly presented itself. I jumped on it, and here I am.
You may have just given me the title for this episode. Luck is preparation meets opportunity. That might be the cap the screen grab for this one. That's great. I really like that a lot. Well, that's the heavy lifting. So I'll move this into the lighter wrap up portion here. What do you do for fun outside of music? What are your hobbies and things?
Well, I mean, right now composition feels like a hobby.
Oh,
It's
I love
exciting
that.
and it's new, and I actually don't get any credit for it in my job. It doesn't count
Ah.
for anything. So it's technically a hobby, and I am grateful to Wavefront Music for publishing the two pieces so far. So
Hmm.
that's great. Let's see. I started learning Spanish as an adult.
Hmm.
I trotted down to the Modern Languages building and took 5 semesters of Spanish, and
Oh, good for
now I'm
you.
just trying not to lose what moderate Spanish I have. I'm not fluent, but that's been really helpful in the world. I know a little bit about jewelry. I've taken a couple
Ooh.
of GIA accredited courses online. Nothing major, I promise. It's just enough to make me really dangerous in the store, and I prefer antique jewelry. So I try to, well, I have to limit it financially. So I try to limit it, but once in a while there's one of those like bargains
Hmm.
that is so beautiful and so enticing financially that like, well, I now I think I know what I'm doing. So yeah, I'm a little dangerous in jewelry.
And do you end up wearing these pieces that you find, or do they get, stored and saved away, or?
I do. I have an Art Deco ring that I only wear on special occasions. Um,
Mhm.
it's beautiful, but it's a little too much for every day. And then
Right.
I have a new ring, well, new to me ring that I just bought for my birthday last year, and I was wearing it a lot. In
Mhm.
fact I wore it at the IHS. Wore it every day at the IHS, and it's a um, like a 1940s ish transitional ring between the old Euro cuts and the modern brilliant diamond. There's a little transitional time in between.
Oh,
So
that's fascinating.
it's beautiful, and that one I feel is a little sturdier and a
Mhm.
little less filigree and delicate, so more appropriate for every day.
Yeah. Oh, that's so fun. What a cool hobby. Like that's I don't even know if I want to call that a hobby. Like what a cool area of knowledge. Like that's so cool.
Yeah, I did a little bit of
That's great.
jewelry, and that was
Hmm.
actually therapy for torn tendons in my arms. So
Oh
that
wow.
was fun. I'm not very good at it, but definitely a lot of fun.
Oh, that's incredible. And then yeah, I guess we'll just kind of wrap this up with do you have any I know you have an upcoming piece for a conference. Do you want to give us a little info about that, which is exciting?
Yeah, I don't want to let too much out of the bag. I am nearly done writing a piece. That one of my grad students actually brought me some music that just needed a little something, and I got inspired with six different ways that she could, treat it in for her recital, and she ended up dumping it on her program because she just couldn't deal with that. And so the second that she let go of it, I started, and so I'm writing an unaccompanied horn solo, and it's going to be playable hopefully by like a sophomore performance major,
Mhm.
something kind of in that level. And this graduate student, Brianna Nay, she's pushed me to try to get it done a little bit quicker. She wants to apply to premiere it at the Hero, I don't know if it's pronounced Hero or Her O. It's
Mm.
capital HER with a little O, national conference that is being held at Florida State University in May. And it's a
Oh,
national
incredible.
conference to celebrate women in music, and so she
Ooh.
wants to premiere it at that conference.
Yay, that's exciting. And do you have any, places we can follow? I know you said you're not big into social media, but do you have a website we can come visit if people are interested in learning more about you or any of that, even if it's FSU's website?
Yeah, FSU's website. I have a bio there. I have bios at
Mhm.
various, Holton the Blank and National Music Festival. I do actually have a domain, but there's nothing there. I mean, I have a YouTube. I have two YouTube channels. One
Oh, that's
is
great.
Michelle Stebleton, I think, and that one my record producer handles. So that
Hmm.
has tracks from the CDs,
Hmm.
and so that would be the CDs I did with Lisa. And also, I have an unaccompanied horn CD out as well. Those were all produced on MSR Classics. So they have that. And then when I wanted to post a few things, I set up, I think it's Prof. Stebleton, I think is the YouTube channel, Prof. Stebleton. So,
I think I saw that because you did a recording of High Havana, which I have
yeah.
linked on my website so people can go and watch you play it, which is cool.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was pandemic lockdown, living room version. And also I had missed an email, which I'm one to do. And I didn't
Yeah.
know that it wasn't a live performance. I thought it was going to be a live performance the next week. And we got an email like 10 o'clock the night before. For those of you who've turned in your videos already, thank you. For the rest of you, you could get them in as soon as possible.
Oh,
And
wow.
the next day was my only day that I had hours that I could set something up and do a recording. I had wall to wall students the rest of the week, and I
Hmm.
thought, oh no, this is supposed to be a video, and
Oh,
so
no.
I frantically like set stuff up, and the room that my computer's in, is square, and the sound was just bouncing around the room, and I couldn't get a
Hmm.
good sound. Even though I have like some decent equipment, but I couldn't get a good sound. I finally just plunked my cell phone up on a stand and sat down and played it. And in the middle of the only take that I was really digging, the garbage truck came up with all of the sirens blaring
Of
and
course.
beeping. And so I had to do, a couple of takes,
Hmm.
because then somebody rang the doorbell during one of them. And, it was just, it was just this, it was this spontaneous, like at 10 o'clock the night before, oh, I have to record this tomorrow. So it's not the best fidelity, and but it is a live take from beginning to end. It's one take,
That's great.
edited. So
Mm.
there's that. Yeah, and then the other one was done in the Luna Boliviana, is also on that. And pretty soon, actually soon to come, FSU's performances from the International Horn Conferences. The
Yes.
International Horn Conference, the most recent one in Kingsville, those
Hmm.
performances are going to be released pretty soon. Yes, we've paid royalties,
That's
because
important. Yes.
composers need to get paid for their work.
Yes. Oh, we could do a whole podcast just about that. We may have to do a part two because I didn't even ask you about how you go about recording pieces by composers you've done. We may have to do a another time,
Yeah,
a couple
yeah,
months from
it's
now
a
or
whole
something.
thing.
It's
Yeah.
a whole process. And that's another place people can follow sort of your your work is through your students. I mean, I spoke to some of them at IHS Kingsville, and they are doing some incredible research. So, I mean, if you go look up any of your students, they're doing great stuff. It's incredible.
Thank you. I'm so proud of them.
No, of
They're the
course.
ones who do the work. So,
Oh, they're so sweet. And they came to my presentation and had all these great questions for me. It was so nice, I love that.
that's fantastic.
It's always nice when, people aren't sleeping through. That was my first presentation, so I was like, oh, good, someone was awake. Well, Michelle, this was so much fun. I could keep talking to you for another hour. I still have so many more questions, so I think we'll have to do a part two sometime. But this has been so great. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been fun, and I wish you the
Good.
best of luck. This is like so exciting, a new podcast, and I'm really truly honored to be a part of the beginning of it too.
Oh, thank you so much.
Especially the beginnings.
Oh yes, you are right in the forefront of this all, and I'm looking forward to letting it out into the world. It's gonna be great. So thank you so much. This has been Represent the Podcast. For more episodes, you can find us at Spotify and Apple Podcasts or on my website, www.caitibethmckinney.com. If you liked what you heard today, please rate us 5 stars or leave a review. Thank you for listening.